The
Um,
boys are back in town. We have not recorded for a while.
yeah, so let's just get into it, right? This is going to be Artifact 63. Didn't really do any kind of actual, I guess, reading to prepare for this other than following the news and whatnot. We're going to split this up into a patron show and also a public show. We're probably going to be talking for at least a couple of hours altogether. And I figured the patrons as well as subscribers are probably wondering what I have to say about what's going on politically. I haven't really done these updates in a bit. The last time I did anything like that was a patron show where I was just going through various market charts and I was just like, all right, something bad is going to happen. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, what the exact effects are going to be, but a lot of this stuff just doesn't look good. And I'm still waiting for, ironically enough, like an even bigger event. But it seems like we've had a bunch of big events already. So, maybe we could just get into it. I remember how last year when we were talking about what would a Biden-Trump rematch look like, and starting around September or so when we recorded that mugshot video on Trump, I was just kind of like ready at that point, thinking that the deck is really stacked against Biden, and there's no way
Mhm.
things are going to get better. And I didn't quite expect the debate performance to be as bad as it was, but I definitely did not expect a good debate performance. Right? I did expect Trump to have the better debate and that this would only get worse by the time September rolls around. Of course, the debate was even worse than anybody anticipated. Well, maybe not anybody, right? A lot of people sort of, that's the thing. Like the biggest conspiracy theories on that side turned out to be more correct than the opposite. Um,
Isn't it crazy that the longer this has gone on since the debate, the timeline for when Democratic leaders noticed that Biden had lost the step and that he seemed confused and like he didn't exactly know what was going on in any particular room that he was in has just been pushed back and back and back. And now it's in 2021 is the earliest reports from Democratic insiders that I've seen leaked to the press about, Joe seemed a little weird back then. It's
mhm.
like, so he's been the president for 3 years through the crisis in Ukraine, through the entirety of the situation in Gaza. You know, all of this has been being spearheaded by a guy who gets mixed up at parties about who he's talking to, not because the number of people that a politician has to be exposed to, and occasionally you might get mixed up, like wandering up to people and treating them as if they were a completely different person from who they actually were, because he's old and his brain just doesn't have the cognitive processing power. And we were subjected to months and months and months of these people being like, "Oh, Joe Biden." If you get him behind closed doors in private meetings when there's not so many distractions and there's no cameras, he's so sharp. He's on top of all of the facts. He's asking pointed questions about hyper specific stuff that even experts are shocked that a high level politician would know about that level of granular detail. And even back then, my first thought was the fact that he's not asking high level questions and is instead getting bogged down in the details. That's like also old person behavior. I work with a lot of elderly and demented patients, and they often get fixated on irrelevant details because it's kind of something that they can focus in on and focus their energies on and be a little more centered for having done so. So I was never impressed by that whole performance of Biden as actually secretly competent. But that debate was one of the saddest things I've ever seen on television.
Mhm.
You go back and you watch Joe Biden in that debate against Paul Ryan in 2012. And fuck all these people, by the way. Fuck all of them forever to the depths of hell. But you could at least appreciate that he used to have some panache. He used to have a sense of timing. Even when he would get tripped up on his words occasionally, he could recover instantly like that. And to see him just standing there with his mouth open, agape, like he can't remember to keep his mouth closed. He said we're going to beat Medicare, or we did beat Medicare. Just impossible to follow turns of phrase. I mean, I don't feel bad for Joe Biden ever. I wish he had stayed in the race and gotten humiliated. Honestly, that was, in terms of just my aesthetic preferences, my ideal, because what he has done with Israel in the Gaza war has been unconscionable, and I wish only the worst for him. And I've been nauseated at the flood of love and support that's been going to him. I understand instrumentally that you have to incentivize this kind of behavior. And so it's incumbent on the media and the politicians to be like, what a brave thing this guy did. What a hero he is. He's putting aside his own personal ambitions and stepping aside for the good of the country when the chips are down and there's an opportunity. But fuck this guy. Fuck him. But at least he used to have some kind of something to offer as a retail politician, and to see that he had gone that far, and that and also to have it dawn on you that the entire political apparatus that has been reassuring you that there's actually some kind of secret competence undergirding all of the ridiculousness that you're subjected to on a daily basis was propping up that's scary. You know, that is really a sign of a system that is exhausting itself. And, you know, Trump is, I guess, the avatar of one potential path out of that system, you know, the dark path or whatever. But there's really nothing that has emerged that suggests like a good path out of that. You know, there's nothing happening in the grassroots. There's nothing even happening in the mid roots, for lack of a better term. You know, there's nothing in, say, the broad middle of the Democratic Party and the left of this country that is gaining steam, that suggests that something is going to happen that is going to supplant these old rusty party machines that don't seem really able to do much of anything competently anymore on either side.
Well, in terms of the secret competence, I mean, I guess it's there only in the very kind of strict sense of there's a kind of process that's put in place, right? We know who Biden is and the kinds of policies he would go for. These are policies that are like more or less in line. I mean, you see like all the DC media liberals now coming out saying, you know, it was a great presidency, right? We have to respect him and what he just did for democracy by stepping aside. Like everything they just said, whether it's Gaza or Ukraine or whatever, all that is a positive to them. And it would have been maybe like some things would have been a little bit different with a different kind of Democrat in power. But generally speaking, I don't expect things to have been, you know, gone a very different, no matter who out of the recognizable faces that we have would have been president. So in that way, there's a secret competence, right? Like we should at least understand that, you know, even if Joe Biden was totally, you know, non-functional, things more or less would go in the way that things more or less go. Now, I didn't actually watch the debate live. I was doing,
Me neither.
I was doing some film work, but in the middle of the debate, just curiosity, I was taking a little break from whatever I was doing. And I was like, let me just check on my phone on Twitter to see just what the commentary is thus far. And then I saw like all these meltdowns. I was like, all right, let me just like look at this debate, I guess, tomorrow. In the same way that like the 2020 debate, I remember when I was just sitting down watching that, and I just could not believe that it was happening. Like it's true, you know, Joe Biden wasn't senile in the same way, but still like the optics of having those two up there, right? People that didn't do anything worthwhile with their lives. There were net negatives. There were drains on the world. And here they are in this contest against each other. It was just too much. I was like, I don't want to see this garbage again. So I watched it on the second day. And one thing that's kind of, I think you could sort of see now as we sort of see what's going on in the background whenever like real issues happen, such as, you know, the president is going senile, or, you know, we think that there's a possibility that we might not win in 2024. All those DC media liberals like Ezra Klein or the Pod Save America guys, the quickness with which they came out, just totally, you know, denigrating the Biden, not the presidency, but the fact that he would go against Trump. It's kind of fascinating because I know for a fact that because they are tuned into what was happening in the background more than I am, for example, obviously more than you are, more than most people watching this, they should have known something was going on. But that's even true for the regular voter who simply just like casually absorbs the news, because starting from like 2021, it was pretty obvious that that Biden was going to have fewer press conferences and fewer of these kinds of, you know, unprompted public appearances where there's like less dependence on a teleprompter. it was very obvious he was going to have far fewer of these events than Trump. It was pretty obvious that Biden was being protected by the wider media ecosystem, by his inner circle, because we had reports on this. I remember in 2021, different like, semi-friendly media like Axios or whatever, they would have headlines like, the so far this presidency has the fewest press conferences in the last 20, 30, whatever number of years it was. And there's only one reason for this, right? If we know that Democrats were complaining about this in relation to Trump for 4 years, that Trump does not appear enough, he doesn't have sufficient conferences, he's afraid of dealing with the media. It's obvious similar things going on with Biden for a different reason, right? In one case, it's because Trump is always under attack. In this case, it's because Biden, has been progressively losing the step more and more. And we know that the insiders that were close to Biden that could leak stuff to the media, at least for 2, maybe 3 years, they knew that something bad was happening. And we knew that as protective as the inner circle was, in the last 2 years, they were especially more protective. So we knew something bad was happening. And whether or not like people don't want to put a specific label on, oh, is it dementia? Is it Alzheimer's? Is there something going on like Parkinson's? Is there some other kind of like issue happening? Forget putting a name on it. We knew that in 2020, Biden did not look great at the debate. He did not look great campaigning. We knew that by the time 24 rolls around, things are just going to go worse. Like he's not aging in the way that other people around him are aging. Now, this might be unfair, right? He seems to have a better diet than Trump. He exercises more than Trump, right? He's actually, pretty fit for his age, but for whatever reason, right? He is more senile than people I know in their mid 80s, right? People in their mid 80s.
Or he's at least less functionally senile.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes people go, because Trump comes across as a little bit senile to me too. He goes on these flights of idiotive fantasy. And he's been riffing on Hannibal Lecter for several months now for some reason. He keeps talking about sharks and, he has that too, but he has energy. He has, he's retained a certain like media presentability and charisma and humor and other things. So he he presents better, even though like objectively, he's probably not any better functioning in a day-to-day sense. He's just as cosseted as Biden is, maybe even more so because of his, great wealth and the number of people that he can rely on of a day to do minor tasks for him. I mean, Biden arguably didn't have as much of that until he became the president. He probably had to do more for himself in a day-to-day sense than Donald Trump really ever has had to in the last like 30 to 40 years. But I remember I texted you the day after the debate. I said, okay, I watched 30 seconds of this thing and Biden is going to lose. It really was. But in terms of the whole the secret competence thing, the real dirty secret there is that the president is actually not that important in modern America. The specific identity of the president. People want the president to be, very energetic, very on the ball, maybe even kind of a micromanager or whatever. But the presidency, because of the dysfunction of the Congress and the hostility of the courts to really just basic functioning of the government, the presidency has been kind of forced to assume a huge array of responsibilities that really constitutionally the office was not designed for, it certainly wasn't what any of the founders had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. And there's just no way that the president can, even in a world where somebody was as politically competent and understood the mechanisms of power in the way that an LBJ or Richard Nixon or somebody like that ascended to the presidency, it's really not structured in a way that it can be run like that anymore, because there's just been way too much responsibility put into that branch of government. It's too specialized. There's too many agencies. I mean, maybe we'll see that kind of get pared down now that the recent Supreme Court decision overturning Chevron deference has come through, because there's a heck of a lot of stuff that is being done by executive branch agencies that is going to be challenged in the courts. And there's a lot of stuff that may be taken out of the wheelhouse of the presidency on the basis that they haven't been given proper authority by Congress in specific statutory language to do that. So I guess we'll see. I mean, in some ways, I actually was not as worried about the possibility of Trump presidency as a lot of people in the media that were hyperventilating about it for many months, because A, we already had one Trump presidency, and he pretty well proved that he, whatever his virtues as a politician, and they're not many, but they are real and they are kind of deep with the specific people that he appeals to, he is not a good manager. He is not a good executive. He could not hold on to personnel seemingly for more than a few months at a time. There was insane turnover in his administration because he is such a thin-skinned little prima donna that anytime he perceives somebody as crossing him or as getting more media attention than him, he cuts ties with them. I mean, Steve Bannon was maybe the only person that had some kind of a vision for like what a Trump first administration might look like. It was a stupid vision, a dark vision. He's definitely a sued, as they say online nowadays. You know, he really thinks he understands the world a lot better than he actually does. But he at least saw something that he thought he could do, and he got thrown out within months because Trump got tired of the media saying that he was the dark Machiavellian puppet master of the Trump administration or whatever. And I thought the same thing would probably happen with this Project 2025 shit. I mean, yes, there is a certain sense that even if Trump is disavowing it now, it's being done with a little bit more of his tacit blessing, because it's a lot of his top advisors that were involved in the crafting of it and are trying to put the pieces in place to enact it when he actually gets into office. But if you had the media fear-mongering about Project 2025 every single day of his presidency, the really wacky stuff that was in there, and probably a lot of the really dark stuff too, he would step back from the brink and say, well, that's not me. That's, you know, some, you know, conservative wackos or whatever. I mean, the thing that Trump has that most other politicians don't have is that his base do not expect, nor do they even want, consistency from him. You know, he can kind of pivot his position to whatever he needs it to be in order to get whatever weird hit of dopamine he gets out of seeing his name in the news every single day, you know? And also, in terms of why I wasn't as worried, it really doesn't seem like it's the executive branch that is in the driver's seat of conservative policy making these days. It's the judicial branch.
Yeah, I was about to comment on that specifically. So first of all, this idea of like these presidential personalities don't seem to matter all that much right now. This goes back to the the Benjamin Studebaker idea of all these entrenched interests, right? They're going all, they're like on rails, right? Going all in a specific direction, no matter who's in office. And weirdly enough, like, there's been like enough coverage, I think, so far, even in, liberal media about stuff like, well, the Supreme Court isn't necessarily ruling exactly in the ways that Republicans might want, in the ways that some conservative voters might want, in the ways that Trump might want, right? They're taking like surprise positions. But I think with a lot of these positions, it ultimately comes down to just kind of removing the president from the equation, right? It's kind of ironic because on the one hand, yeah, so if they are now granting this like presidential immunity for so-called official acts, right, you can't be prosecuted for those actions. That's probably more so a way of just like eliminating headaches for both parties. So like, if Biden wants to do something truly crazy right now, right, he could probably do it right now. If Trump wants to do something a little crazy, he could do that right now. But at the same time, there's all these other forces now in play, right, that are trying to restrain them. And I think little by little, like we're just, we're removing all the kind of paperwork and hassles and headaches that something like a Trump presidency might provide, right? This idea of prosecuting him, or, like, okay, we want to like take that out of the equation. We're not going to worry about that anymore. And now it's in the hands of the judicial branch, essentially. Now it's in the hands of lawmakers in the background somewhere. And this kind of goes for both parties, right? Like we seem to be, we're still going very much in the direction of, just privatization. And in terms of like, the personalities and like turnover. So if we have Trump at the top with staff turnover, with how messy everything is and how unfavorable it seems, at least to be like in polite liberal circles, if you worked for his administration, Biden seems to be somewhere in the middle. But Kamala Harris seems to be like right below Trump in that way. So she also had an extremely high turnover, substantially higher
Hmm.
than Biden did when he was vice president, right? If we talk about from, those first 4 years under Obama versus the first 4 years under Biden, Kamala Harris definitely has a turnover. From the leaks, I'm not so sure if she's one of these like totally, crazy bosses that has, fits and yells or whatever it might be. But there, there's reporting like when Jean Pierre was in yeah, so like she was supposedly on loan from the Biden administration for the campaign, and then eventually like she went back to being the press agent, obviously for
Hmm.
Biden. There was like some incident where all the Harris staff said how uncomfortable they were just like seeing this extremely tense conversation when she was being chewed out by Harris. So there's definitely like an element, there's definitely like that girl boss, psychotic, psychopathic even energy to Harris. The question is like how,
It's really in the background with her though, because
yeah,
she doesn't have that Hillary Clinton ice chewing psychopath who just wants power vibe to her. She in public mostly comes across as like checked out and silly, and
mhm.
she's like slurring her words sometimes, and she's always laughing too much, which is both. I've come to the conclusion that it's kind of a negative and a positive for her. It's a negative in the sense that it just is weird and off-putting, but it's kind of a positive in the sense that the conservatives are going to have a harder time doing a Hillary Clinton to her. She just
Mhm.
does not come across as a striver in the same way, even if objectively the stuff that you have to do to get to the position that Kamala Harris has gotten to is identical.
Yeah.
Even if she did the exact same things that Hillary Clinton has done, for much of her career, whether it's sticking up for people that probably she shouldn't have stuck up for, or taking positions that probably she should not have taken in order to just court as broad of an array of voters as she possibly could. The stink of that is not on her as strongly. But at the same time, there is a certain, I mean, Trump is not serious, but Trump is kind of in his own category. But there is a certain like unseriousness to her that I think, as we get away from the love fest that has emerged in the last few days, and people have to actually look at Harris as a candidate, I think the sort of, oh, this is like your mom's kind of goofy friend, or your aunt that you see a couple of times a year that your parents aren't particularly close to. I think that's going to put some people off that are maybe positive on it right now. However, Trump is really reeking of loserdom lately
Yeah.
too. I
Oh
mean,
my
Trump is
God.
doing
Yeah. Oh
quite
my
poorly.
goodness.
He
He's
picked
he's
JD Vance.
and he's talking about suing Democrats for making him run against Biden and then switching him out. When I saw that, I was like, "Oh my God, what a fucking pathetic loser!" Because like the first thing I thought about was he did have that leaked moment from he was like golfing somewhere, and I guess like a fan came up to him and started talking about the debate, and he was like, "Oh, did you see that?" Yeah, I really broke down that old piece of crap, right? He's going to drop out. He's going to drop
Yeah.
out. And I was like, all right, I think his instincts are correct. I expect Biden to drop out no matter what he says publicly. And then the second thing he said was, and then what? It's going to be me against Kamala Harris. Can you imagine that? She is so pathetic. She is so pathetic. And I mean, there's something to that idea in the sense that, first of all, there might be something not totally self-confident and put together about Harris. Like in preparation for a meeting with a major donor, she was like doing some sort of like mock dinner, like a dinner dress rehearsal essentially, where she would be
Mm-hmm.
like, some, like a bottle of wine or whatever, because she was so nervous about this dinner. And it's like, why? Like, what are you nervous about? Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
like act like you're the fucking vice president, even if you're not self-confident. Just like be like, who the fuck are you?
Yeah.
I'm VP. Why doesn't you like I don't understand how you can't fake through that without being so anxious. But there's that element, right? But at the same time, uh obviously Republicans are having a meltdown that they're not running against Biden because it was obvious Biden was going to lose. It was pretty obvious to me starting like last fall, after the debate. It's like it's obvious what's going to happen here. And he seemed to sort of relish a little bit the idea of running against Harris. But then again, I'm not so sure because she obviously does not have the same flaws that Biden has. Between Biden and Trump, I think Trump is the clear winner. Between Trump and Harris, it's not 100% clear. It's probably at the very least going to be a closer race because now all those liabilities, right, whether it's the age, whether it's like the stink of the previous administration, all of that is now there. The fact that he's behaving like a loser. And also, again, yeah, to get back to the JD Vance thing, I was honestly kind of shocked that he was chosen. Maybe I wasn't paying attention enough to who exactly the VP picks were going to be. But Burgum, like in between the two, I don't understand
Burgum was right there.
Yeah,
Burgum was right there.
And they're very similar in the sense that Burgum, he is this guy that grew up, he was born and he did grow up in North Dakota, right? So that's part of it. And he did eventually make his way into tech, right? He became a billionaire by selling his company to Microsoft in late 90s. So now he has over $1 billion. So he's definitely been heavily involved in tech, just like JD Vance. But between the two of them, and also, I mean, he won very handily in North Dakota, right? Whereas Vance, he definitely struggled. I don't really see with the exception of like, oh, he's younger and he's in with this kind of tech crowd. I think maybe part of the calculation was, well, now since Biden is clearly going to lose and he's still going to be the nominee, if we get Vance in, that's going to totally lock down the more kind of cringy, weird right wing donor money like Musk or Peter Thiel, who are more friendly and direct with Vance. Whereas Burgum, he's more kind of like maybe on the outside. There's less of that maybe energy. But Vance, he's just like, and not to be looksist, but he looks like fucking shit. He looks horrible. Honestly, just based on the optics. Look, I understand that Kamala Harris has a weird laugh. I understand she's off-putting in some ways, but in other ways, she's just kind of fucking cute, right? There is something likable about her. She's objectively physically attractive. Vance looks like shit. He's so doughy. He looks really effeminate. He sounds stupid when he talks. Like there's no, if that was the sole calculation that Trump was making, I want some of the more kind of high energy techie money coming in. Well, that was a bad calculation because now Musk, right? He began by saying he was going to give $50 million a month to Trump, that's exactly the kind of thing that wins elections, right? That's literally would be the kind of thing. And now he's like, now I'm not so sure. Now I'm not a cult personality. Let me explain to you guys what's happening. All the techies and all the crypto people, they are now trying to spread their money around because they understand that it's no longer a lock for Trump. So now Musk is going to be making these overtures maybe to the Democratic Party. Some of these people in crypto that were so like against like a Kamala or a Biden presidency. Now they're going to be spreading the wealth around. And this latter part, I think, is especially like people should really pay attention to how money in politics works because it's very, very visible right now. So in the last few months, like all the crypto people have come out rallying and, behind Trump. Many of them, they were making, like either like the fake sort of like, freedom arguments. Some of them were just making, straight kind of like, like if we want the policies that we want to get for crypto, we need to go with Republicans. But now they're not so sure. Now it's like, the Winklevoss twins and others are like, well, if Harris is serious about crypto, she should do more than public statements because there was a whole big thing recently about is she going to show up at the Bitcoin conference where Trump is going to be speaking. Now, maybe I misread the article, but they were making it seem as if Trump was getting anywhere between tens to even potentially something like 150 million to do this conference because to sit down with donors, it was something like 800,000 or something like per head. And there's going to be like 160 people. Like, I'm not sure if I misread that. It seems too much to me, but that's not a direct campaign contribution, but that is a bribe. Now, if Harris was making these overtures, she was actually last week, she was reaching out to crypto people, asking questions. I don't know if she knows anything about crypto or whatever, but the point is like, they know that there's like hundreds of millions of dollars up for grabs. And we know this because in 2022, right after the whole FTX collapse, like it was revealed that although Sam Bankman, he was making it seem as if he was, I'm only gonna contribute to Democrats, for favorable policies because I don't want a Trump presidency. Turns out that he and his partners, They were equally funding Democrats and Republicans. Now, the same thing is going to happen, with these crypto, like they will make all the public pronouncements that they want. They will say things like, if you're serious about the crypto vote, you have to know there is no fucking crypto vote. There's only hundreds of millions of dollars up for grabs in terms of bribes. There is no voting block in terms of crypto. Nobody cares about crypto in terms of like policy. The only people that care are the people that are, that would benefit from it. And that's hundreds of millions, if not more, in money up for grabs. That's really this bottom line. And we see how, like whatever things that Harris or Trump might say, like Trump was outright trying to ban crypto a few years ago. Now he's like, I love Bitcoin. It's literally just the bribes. It's all that it comes down to. When we see this very visibly, we see the arguments very visibly. They're happening on Twitter. We see the back and forth. We have a very special in this niche industry. That's another thing. Most people are probably not paying attention because most people don't pay attention to crypto. But if you are looking into this, you see how the niche industry reacts. And this is just a microcosm for it, how it happens in much bigger spaces like APAC or whatever, military industrial complex more broadly, like all of that. So anyway, like I at least I'm glad that we're able to see this out in the open.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the one good thing about what you're talking about. That's maybe the one advantage that Harris can derive from being the senator from California specifically, is she probably has more experience dealing with this kind of tech money space than most other politicians. I actually think being from California is probably on net a bad thing, because California is, as much as libs like to go, oh, it's the fifth largest economy in the world just on its own, it's also incredibly expensive. There's homelessness problems all over the state. It doesn't have the sort of social democratic basis in its services the way that some parts of the Northeast have. So there's not even alleviating factors to living there the way that there is in like New York City as a poor or like lower middle class person or whatever. The thing with, if Vance was picked because he courts the tech class or whatever, that is ridiculous, because in terms of retail politics, the tech class is also more and more in bed with the biggest political freaks in this country, which is the neo-reactionary people, the people that read Curtis Yarvin and think, oh, we need some sort of corporate
He's such a
monarchy.
bad fucking writer. He recently tweeted out like some essay that he wrote. What a bad writer. Like, these people have no respect for craft. Forget it. Before you even get to the ideas, he's writing very much also in that Twitter speak. Like, that's not, I know I always keep making this point, but
it's like,
but like the way that everybody, no matter where you are ideologically, if you're on Twitter, you just absorb Twitter language. Like, do you have any fucking self-respect? Don't you want to sound like yourself? Why do you want to sound like everybody else? I don't get it. Yeah. Before we even get to the question of whether or not Yarvin's ideas are moronic or not, why do you sound like everybody else?
Yeah, no, it's awful. And the quote unquote, the traditionalists, the return with a V people, there is the pro-natalist people that are obsessed with birth rates. That's big in Silicon Valley, and Elon Musk in particular is very panicky about that. There is the anarcho-capitalist and right-wing libertarian people who have gotten more and more fash curious over the years. I know Trump specifically got booed at the Libertarian convention, but I would say the Libertarian Party matters less to libertarianism as a movement more broadly than
why was he booed?
In my lifetime.
I remember he was booed, but
because he's not very Libertarian Party coded. I think a lot of, he expanded the regulatory state in certain ways. He's there was certain, like, he spent on the military industrial complex and things like that. And he's in favor of the security state and the police state, and these are the one set of issues that libertarians are not terrible on, is being afraid of government surveillance and things like that. So even if Vance brings those people into your camp, it also brings a lot of and the race stuff, of course. I mean, that's the biggest issue, obviously, in a national political campaign, is a lot of these people are just openly racist. Curtis Yarvin is openly racist. Mencius Moldbug, he's not, like, race is not the focus of what he talks about, but he takes for granted that the people who say that Black people just have a low IQ and they can't function on their own and they need somebody to be making policy for them and be, quote unquote, taking care of them, are absolutely correct. And the race realists, and JD Vance just unfollowed Steve Saylor
Mhm.
the good friend of Jared Taylor, friend of the channel, and and so you have that stink, but also there was that one thread that you sent to me that was the guy was arguing that maybe Republicans are looking to the tech side of things as being the one educated space in this country that is still kind of right wing that they can draw from as just functionaries for the administrative state. But those people, I mean, A, they're not going to make as much money in government as they are in what they're doing right now. So they're probably not going to want those jobs. And B, they're not going to be competent at those jobs. Like they don't know anything about running a government agency. I mean, it's a swamp for a reason, like it's
It's that
inhospitable
kind
for
of
things to
like
grow outside of it.
it's like that, rough intelligence coding, for a lot of people, it gets transposed onto, actual competence and like doing something, right? It's why
Yeah.
people like Christopher Langan thinks that he ought to rule the world. When in fact, like
Mm-hmm.
he has no competence in anything outside of like a very, very limited kind of niche. Same thing with tech people now. When it comes to like the money argument, I can imagine that a lot of tech people maybe they were been somewhere in the background. Maybe they made a bunch of money and they're not necessarily famous. I think a lot of people would be willing to set aside money for the sake of getting into government, right, or into like culture more broadly, or to be like assumed to be like part of these kinds of happenings, right? After a certain amount of time, you might get bored of money, you might be bored of these kinds of weird parties that you might attend, the Diddy parties and whatnot. Um, but but as far as competence, yeah, like there's this like idea of like as long as you're roughly educated or roughly have a high enough IQ, you're going to be competent in X, Y. That's obviously untrue, right? The only thing
That's
that
how they
builds
coaxed us into
competence,
college 15 years
yeah,
ago. They said, "Oh, as long as you're educated, it doesn't really
yeah.
matter what you're educated in. That's
Mhm.
just a homogenous, massive people that can plug into any sector of the economy." And that's just not true anymore.
Yeah. And also, I mean, like when it comes, if that's the argument you're going to make, like broadly speaking, educated, broadly speaking, critical thinking skills, like you have to do that on your own. Like you have to read books on your own. You have to think
Mm-hmm.
about things on your own, right? All that college does, it confers a degree, right? Which is like it's like a proof of something. The question is what? And the answer for what that is has been slowly changing over time in terms of the ramifications, right? Consequences we could get out of a college degree. All that is changing, but still, yeah, so like I find that I find that kind of funny. Like was the idea that Vance was gonna like rally the Rust Belt? I mean,
I yeah that it's yeah it's coming out
he
now that
he wasn't that
sorry.
competitive though. He wasn't that competitive. You know what I mean?
No, he
Like,
was no, and yeah, no, he did actually poorly in Ohio,
mhm.
considering the political demographics of that state. He ran behind Trump in terms of like how much support he got in 2022, and he did, I believe, worse than the average Republican senator that was elected in that year. But supposedly, it's come out now that they were thinking that in a situation where Biden stayed in the race, then Vance would just sort of be the Rust Belt guy, and people probably wouldn't pay that much of attention to him. And it was like a football spike, kind of. He thought he could run the numbers up in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and some of these Rust Belt states, and it would make Biden's loss worse, and maybe he would get a little bit more electoral votes than he otherwise would have. But in a situation where Kamala's in the race and Vance is on Tucker Carlson a few years ago saying that she's a childless cat lady with no stake in the future, which is weird right wing arguments about like step parents are not real parents and adopt. And I think he also included Pete Buttigieg in that. Now, this might have been before Pete Buttigieg adopted his kids in 2021. I'm not sure what the timing of that appearance on Tucker Carlson was, but I mean, he was a gay man who very well could have adopted, so you're implicitly shitting on adoption as a mechanism of raising kids, which is something that traditionally conservatives are quite into. That was the whole argument about abortion for years is, hey, you could just give the kid up for adoption. There's plenty of people that want kids that don't have them. You don't have to kill a baby in order to not have to be a parent, blah, 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 blah. So, and in a context where they're trying to push expansion of the abortion bans that have already been put into place in a number of states, more widely into more states, this guy who is pushing these weird natalist talking points, these weird, we need our population numbers to go up talking points. It's not good. And he's, Kamala is kind of off-putting, but Vance is incredibly off-putting
Yeah,
now at this point.
he's creepy. Yeah, he's definitely a scaring the host type of candidate. I mean, it's bad
Yeah,
enough that the Republicans have to deal with the fact that Roe v. Wade, this thing that they sort of wanted, sort of didn't want. They wanted to be this war of attrition forever, right? They're sort of setting up the judiciary and they're setting up the arguments to ultimately eventually overturn Roe, and yet their actual long-term desire, as is the Democratic Party desire, which is, always have this be as law, but also in this weird state of limbo. And we're going to be doing this tug of war forevermore. And eventually the
yeah,
thing that they set, the trajectory on, it happens, right? And this happens all the time, right? I mean, politically, geopolitically, whether it's like America or Israel set, like funding, terrorist groups or whatever, and eventually it comes back to you, like all this stuff. It's kind of the tension between like short-term politicians, which are always like part of this, monster, versus the long-term trajectory. Because eventually, short-term politicians, they get traded, new people come in, and then eventually some short-term person, whether it's Trump or whoever else, they're gonna have to deal with the fallout. So there's Roe v. Wade, and there's also the fact that, like, I was kind of surprised that Trump did not go for, first of all, a woman. All right. Second of all, like probably like someone that's not white. I haven't really thought this through, so I don't know exactly how it would play out if Trump were to pick somebody like Nikki Haley as VP. But that strikes me as immensely better than whatever this is.
I think he was going to pick Kristi Noem, and then she came out and said that she killed a dog for a incredibly poor reason, so that she got nixed from consideration. And I think Haley, there was just too much bad blood from the primary, and Trump couldn't figure out how he could justify to voters how much he shit on her, and then he picked her as his
Well,
VP.
what about Vance? I mean, like it's the same shit, like
Well,
Vance
Vance shit
calling
on
him
Trump.
Hitler, calling like all this stuff, right?
Well, I am totally sold on the theory that Don Jr. was the really big fan of JD Vance, and he basically
Mhm.
talked his dad into thinking that Vance represented like a much more energized constituency and a larger constituency that he actually does. And then, I mean, there's the quote out there now that Trump just kind of watched him on TV. He's like, "Oh, look at those beautiful blue eyes!" Like such an old like 1970s and 1980s media guy way of looking at
Mhm.
presidential candidates. Like that's the only thing voters are going to see is those big beautiful blue eyes. We're not really going to listen to anything he has to say. And that's actually the best case scenario now, is that historically vice presidential picks are not that important to the outcome of presidential elections. They're basically there to not be a burden on the presidential campaign. But that doesn't seem like that's. I mean, maybe Vance can pull it out and start triangulating back towards being normal, but he is below Sarah Palin's initial approval rating at
Yeah,
this point.
I
He's
think
like,
he's like double digits negative, right? Which is the first time in decades that something like
yeah,
that has happened. And
yeah,
in terms of like VPs not being instrumental, I think that was true historically, but now since like everything, and I've said this before in this channel, but everything is progressively getting more and more competitive, right? In any kind of way that's imaginable, everything is getting competitive because the pie overall might be getting bigger, but there's more and more people, getting at it. There's less and less to go around in lots of like important respects. So, something like a VP pick, it's going to be critical. And like, I think Kamala
mm-hmm.
Harris obviously is much more competitive now than Biden would be. But just like Trump like fucked up big time with Vance, I'm hearing now the possibility of like a Buttigieg VP, and um that
I don't buy that. I don't buy
yeah,
that at all.
I don't buy it either. But if that does happen, like I think that would be like a Vance, maybe not the same as a Vance level misstep, but still substantial enough where like Trump now seems less competitive. Now it's gonna like we're in this kind of like constant seesaw. I think really as soon as things started really going haywire, like in the fall, then especially like after the debate, uh, people should just assume that things going forward are just going to be high. Like there's not going to be the kind of room for massive errors that were like possible with like I don't know, like what was it, like a 400 plus electoral college win, right, for Reagan. Like that sort of
Hmm.
thing is like so much less possible now. And it means that since that's less possible, what you'll see on the ground in terms of like what are the fundamental forces at play that actually make this impossible, it's going to be stuff like, okay, Biden is clearly has like no chance to win now after the debate. Whether or not he says he's going to drop out, the fact is he's going to drop out. At that point, I was pretty certain that he would. He's going to drop out. And now, what's suddenly competitive is Trump fucked things up badly with the Vance pick, and now Harris is here, and now something's going to be out there to goad her to make some kind of mistake. But ultimately, we're going to like narrow things down to, you know, a more competitive race than otherwise would be. And like, what do you think about this in general? Because I don't know how much the nature of like everything being competitive, whether it's like if you're, you know, making YouTube videos or you're a writer, like whatever it might be, presidential picks, whatever. What about the fact that since 2016, we seem to every election now seems to be pretty crazy, right? I guess 2008 was a little bit crazy in the sense of like, oh, everything is so new. We have a black president. That's, you know, that's kind of different.
We have a
But
hope and change president. That was
yeah,
also important too, you know.
yeah. But
But
that in its own way though, that's still kind of like the same echo that we had of Bill Clinton, and also the same echo that we had of Reagan. All three of those candidacies that were based on like fundamental changes, a fundamental reorganizing of the contract between, you know, America and Americans. But starting in 2016, 2020, 2024, right? It's things just feel a lot more crazy. And I wonder, is it simply that like in this theory of things being more competitive, things like illusions, they have less and less of a place, right? Because part of this competition is like stuff like Twitter, like social media, that forces a lot of these conversations to be a lot more public, right? We know how money in politics works much more easily now. We know how fickle it is. We know how little, you know, these people actually have like core ideologies, right? We know that it's just a matter of getting money into the pockets of potentially sympathetic politicians. And we know that most politicians are sympathetic to whatever cause, right? Assuming that they themselves remain competitive. So like, what do you chalk up to this set of changes where the last three elections now have been pretty crazy?
I mean, you can chalk some of it. I emphasize only some of it up to the fact that we only have two major political parties, and one of them has been turned into a giant cult of personality around a single unhinged figure. You know, I mean, you can chalk some of it up to that. I mean, Trump is a little bit singular, and there really hasn't been any success that the Republicans have had in building a Trump-like movement outside of Trump himself. Everybody that has tried to run on this sort of national conservative, you know, maybe we're a little bit more friendly to workers and unions, and maybe we're not so crazy about deregulation and blah blah blah. I mean, you know, Trump governed like a regular Republican when he was office, but he's at least aesthetically trying to have the appearance of a less draconian tax cuts, benefits cuts Republican, the way that somebody like Mitt Romney was. But the movement outside of Trump himself has been incredibly weak and has really lost in a lot of places. But I would more so say it's just that these are the, you know, the agonized death throes of a world hegemon becoming not the hegemon anymore. You know, the America was in a pretty plum position for a very long time to be the place in the world where all of the cheap goods that were manufactured elsewhere, you know, flooded into, and you could buy them for relatively inexpensive in Walmart. And yeah, you know, the job that you could have had 20 years ago is not as good, but you don't need as much money to, you know, your day-to-day life. Food is not that expensive. A lot of recreation activities are not that expensive. Electronics are not that expensive. You could buy a bike relatively inexpensively. You can have a car. You can have cheap gas to go kind of wherever it is that you want to go. And America's position in the world is just not that dominant anymore. I mean, China is coming up as a power. I think it's an open question whether they want the position that America had as the world bestriding colossus and sort of the director of international events. I think that they're being a lot more circumspect about stepping into that role as America flakes away from it. But you have Russia trying to assert itself, and become kind of a dominant power in Eastern Europe and certain parts of the Middle East. And I think that that sort of plumb position that America has been in, as it's not even going to get that bad probably, but just as it becomes less plumb, then people are not used to living like that anymore. You're just going to see people with resentments toward these politicians. You're going to see people seeking out weirdos to come and fix it. You're going to see people getting more mad at incumbents than they usually do. It wouldn't surprise me if Harris was also a one-term president, if the same media machine that was able to tarnish Biden over the course of 4 years, despite him not really doing anything that crazy liberal or left. I mean, he had a pretty big infrastructure bill, but not as big as he wanted to. He had the CHIPS Act, which Republicans should like, and I don't quite understand the idea that there was something like crazy left about that. He had a pretty big stimulus bill that actually ended up making the American recovery stronger than most of the rest of the world's recovery from the COVID recession. So, I mean, if the GOP can turn those results into just, in the minds of a lot of voters, a world historic failure on the economy. And I actually do think that Biden has been quite poor in a number of ways, but in ways that are not really the talk of the town in DC media and in the national media and even in people's kitchens or kitchen table conversations or whatever. But if they can turn that around and make him into a world historic failure, it wouldn't surprise me if they could do it with Kamala too. I already saw their first attack ad on her is that she is a crazy far leftist, way too liberal person. They cherry picked all of these quotes from when I think it was from when in 2020 she was kind of trying to triangulate between the Biden wing of the party and the Bernie wing of the party, and she was sort of saying like, yeah, I agree, ICE has a lot of problems, or yeah, I kind of agree that we need to be doing more to phase cars out of our infrastructure and things like that, and they're trying to portray her as that. I mean, if there was further crisis with Russia during her term, if the war in Gaza were to expand into a wider regional war, if Netanyahu could hold that off until after the election of Kamala Harris and turn it into a stink that attached to her, if gas prices continue to go up as oil production, if as oil production kind of very slowly, baby steps, starts to get phased out of being just the absolute center of the global economy and thing that everybody triangulates their politics and their policies around. If consumer goods prices continue to go up, as there's been a real push amongst the elite classes to try and reshore manufacturing into America after the COVID pandemic showed just how flawed it can be to have such long supply chains for absolutely everything. Food production, if climate change continues to, steadily chip away at how much food is produced by like 3%, 4%, 5%, and supply and demand laws just, and also the ability of companies to price gouge a little bit and blame supply and demand, for their price gouging. If food prices go up, if there's a lot of stuff that could just see the American standard of living continue to decline under a Kamala presidency or a second Trump presidency, even if there's some weird God kiss thing where stuff just does not stick to him in the same way that it does to most politicians. It wouldn't be surprised to me if, the next several election cycles were just continue to be crazy and you saw one-term presidents and you saw weirdos running. And I mean, it's people are attracted to extreme ideas and personalities that they typically would not have considered when there's a fear of falling, when they're scared. I mean, the whole economic anxiety thing, got turned into a meme by liberals after 2016 so they could, assume a greater air of moral superiority over Trump voters or whatever. But people are anxious, man. Like the world's not in a good state right now. Things kind of feel like they're falling apart. That there was just a massive outage of computer systems across a number of integral economic sectors the other day, and some airlines are still having like outages and canceling flights. Healthcare costs continue to go up, and Medicare and Medicaid payments have actually gone down under Joe Biden, which is something that has not been talked about enough in a lot of the media.
Before we move to the patron show, I just want to quickly go over this very lightning rod issue of, I guess, all the talk of Kamala Harris as a DEI president, or DEI meaning diversity, equity, inclusion, vice president, however you want to frame it now that she's running to be president. And just to sort of, because I feel like, there's any number of ways to tease this out. And the way that we would discuss this, obviously, it wouldn't be in the way that Republicans or typical Twitter racists might discuss this. Obviously, when you say something like, X black person, right, or whatever, or woman is a DI candidate, there's always a tone of racism or sexism underneath. Not to mention the fact that this idea of being a DEI anything, as an extension, let's just say, of political correctness, that is a thing that everybody does, right? That is a thing that Republicans do. That is a thing that Democrats do. That is a thing that racists do. That is a thing that liberals do. And it comes out in different ways depending on who you are and what your strategy is, right? There's a political correctness on the right. There's a political correctness on the left. Now, the political correctness on the right would look something like, well, Trump is running for office in 2016. A lot of Christians, they are nervous about him because he doesn't seem to be that religious. He doesn't seem to be, like a serious or like a good person in that way. So, okay, let's get Mike Pence. Why is he selected? He's selected specifically to, be essentially like a carpet that is hung up that everybody could look at, that they could point to and say, okay, now we feel safe with Trump. Pence himself, right? Bad politician, very low favorability ratings, right? He was net negative, double digits, right, in his home state for a long time. There was he was never considered, very talented. We hardly heard about him, before Trump even mentioned his name. But he was chosen for these kinds of accolades and for these aesthetics, right? For the optics. He is in that way a DI candidate, right? He's an older man with white hair. He's white, right? You don't have to be scared. That's DI essentially, right? If Hillary Clinton picks a male as her VP to balance the ticket, that is to sort of placate the people that might feel like, what, maybe I don't feel totally comfortable, with a like an all-female ticket, right? In the same way that I'm positive that Kamala Harris, she would not try to balance the ticket by, choosing a white woman. I'm pretty sure that wouldn't happen. It would most likely be a male, and that male will most likely be white. So all these things are part of it, right? All this idea of like DI, like everybody is doing Vance, right? Beautiful
It's
blue
just
eyes.
politics, man.
Yeah, exactly, right. So in this
It's
kind
like
of
talking
like,
about DEI and politics is insane because
yeah,
for basically ever people that are involved in politics as their primary avocation, they think about things in these terms.
mhm.
They think about like, what demographics does this person appeal to? What constituencies can we activate if we put this person or we push this policy, this, that, or the other thing? I mean, the idea of DEI as an insult, where it is not just a pretty naked substitute for the N word, which it frankly often is. I mean, you could just see it, like, even before a politician does anything, you'll see people say, "Oh, this was a DEI person," or they'll talk. I mean, they will just use DEI as a way to say black people a lot of the
Mhm.
time too. Like, they will just assume that, but that a black person is, of course, unqualified. But the best faith, and it doesn't deserve it, but I will steelman it slightly just for the sake of argument and rhetoric. The best faith explanation of what DEI as an insult, as a descriptor, is somebody who was selected for a position on the basis, on some basis other than their like intrinsic merit for the position, and specifically, someone who was selected because there is a broad social sense that we need to balance out the demographic composition of our powerful institutions, and therefore we need to put more emphasis on selecting, whether it's minorities of various characters,
Mhm.
or even women who are not technically a minority, but they are, historically marginalized in terms of their position in powerful institutions. So that's the definition. But I mean, you can kind of make sense of it when people are talking about like private business or whatever. But in politics, that it really just doesn't make sense. I mean, specifically in a country where there's no longer any racial qualifications, or openly racial qualifications for voting. There's no sex qualifications for voting. You're not disenfranchised if you're gay or trans or Latino or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to talk about DEI, because why an individual person values a politician it's a completely black box. That's not something that politicians or political advisors or political parties can really attend to. They can only attend to these things in aggregate. And if the electorate responds positively to, say, having more women or more Latinos or more Black people or whatever as your coterie of elected officials, then it doesn't really matter why they're there. But also the idea that there are people in this political machine that are competent and they're being passed over or whatever is insane to me. You're telling me that JD Vance, who has been bankrolled by Peter Thiel to the tune of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, is, he did something so much more meritorious because he was able to join the military and go to Yale Law School. Maybe that's slight, but Kamala Harris did better seeking elected office in her state than JD Vance did. She's held a wider variety of offices than JD Vance has in the public sphere. She's been a prosecutor, she's been an attorney general, she's been a senator, she's been a vice president. If we're talking about DEI, if we're talking about the idea that somebody is not ascending to a position based on the merits, in as much as just being there is part of the merits, in any consideration, she's been there more than he fucking has. It's crazy.
But not to get too controversial on this question in relation to Kamala Harris, I think there is something to be said, if only for the way that DEI can easily be weaponized against her by Republicans, not even by, going through typical, Republican racist, style talking points, but by the way that the Biden administration treated her and by the way that the superstructure, foisted her up and treated her, in the sense that, okay, when she was first elected as VP, that came as a result of Joe Biden essentially saying something along the lines of, I forget the exact quote, but it was when I pick my VP, it's going to be a Black woman, right? That's what he said. So he was committed to a Black woman. Now, that is not DEI,
and
right?
He passed over Stacey Abrams, and she still hasn't fucking gotten over it either.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's that's not to say that there were other people that would necessarily be more qualified than Kamala Harris or whatever, and she's getting it just because she's Black. But let's just listen to the language, right? So you have Biden's language about, I'm going to pick a Black woman. Now, it would be one thing if he says that, and then he puts her in all these roles that are, they really test her. These are things that really bring out the best of Kamala Harris. These are things that, really raise her up, and everybody looks at her and says, wow, isn't it so wonderful that she was selected? But the exact opposite happened. So he says, I'm going to pick a Black woman. He picks his Black woman. He picks a woman that lost, the primary badly in her own state to Biden.
Well, she didn't even lose. She dropped out before she could lose.
Dropped out because it was something 2% polling or whatever it was. So what that means is Joe Biden, when he's making his selection, he knows that he's selecting a vice president and that the main purpose of the job is you're going to have to take over if Joe Biden has to either, resign or, if he's not going to seek reelection. He did say at the time, he did at least imply that he was not going to seek reelection if he gets elected. He said he was going to be this interim president. He's going to hand over the reins of power. But if that's what you're doing and you have a VP pick, you should know for as soon as she was selected, I was all right. So my mind in 2020 was, all right, there's a pretty good chance that Biden is not going to seek re-election in 2024 because he's going to be too old. That was immediately where my mind went. Secondarily, we know that Kamala Harris is unpopular, and she, even if she's not guaranteed to be, the nominee in 2024, there's a pretty good chance that she will be because she's the vice president. That's just how it works. So he's selecting her for being a Black female, but also he does not trust her, right? We have all these leaks now that says, he did not want her to be the nominee because he does not trust her against Trump. he puts her in these
Mhm.
roles. Like it's true that she was not actually the border czar, right? Her role is more like she's gonna do like soft diplomacy with Guatemala. And it was like two or three other South American countries where a lot of migrants are coming over, and soft diplomacy to make sure that there's like fewer border crossings, like that sort of thing. So she's not a border czar, but she's put in something that no Democrat wants to do. They don't want to be attached to this. So she gets the worst jobs. The last few years, there's been a lot of leaks from her camp, actually, like the cave hive types are like, we keep thinking that she's not being, really put up to challenges. She's being put into least visible and most awkward and least desirable roles. So all throughout his presidency, Joe Biden is treating her like a DI pick. He's just thinking, I'm going to coast on the fact that I have a black woman here. And I'm not going to let her do anything because I don't trust her to do anything. But I'm going to be able to, just like JD Vance is, Trump's carpet. She's going to be my personal carpet here. I'm going to wear her. People are going to look me and pat her on the head and pat me on the head. Like he exactly treated her like, the stereotype of a DEI hire, whatever, that sort of, terminology entails in the conservative mind. That's exactly how he treated her. I don't think there's any way that you could fairly look at the last 4 years and especially the last couple of months and come to any conclusion other than that, right? So there's a lot of, weaponization that can be done now because this is how Democrats have seen her, right? Like, why'd you
Yeah.
choose her if you thought that she's going to be so bad, right?
Yeah. And specifically the fact that I, I mean, you could basically make the case that he ran in the primary for her. People are now trying to say, oh, it's not undemocratic. People were voting for Harris too when they voted for Biden in the primary. But I mean, yeah, they knew that she would be the vice president, but you're voting for the president.
Mhm.
That's not probably 90% of your thought when you're voting for the president is who's going to be the president.
Yeah.
So the idea that basically he used his incumbency advantage to bowl everyone else over in the primary and keep out anybody that if she had to run herself might have challenged her and even beat her, because she was incredibly unpopular for basically the entirety of his presidency so far. His approval ratings have been low, but for a lot of it, hers were even lower than his. It's really only in the last like 6 to 7 months that she's kind of crept back up over him because he's become so toxic and
Yeah.
so unpopular. Uh,
And
and
the only reason, like in my mind, like maybe I'm
and then he
wrong.
hands it off to her
Yeah.
after he's already, basically cleared the primary field of any sort of credible challengers. And
Hmm.
then he endorsed her, creating a situation where there couldn't even be like a mini primary or something like that to seek sort of what is the mood of the party. Do we want to go with the VP? Do we want to go with like a popular red state Democratic governor like Bashir or Gretchen Whitmer or JD Pritzker or Roy Cooper or whoever, like there was basically no allowance for even like time for Democratic input of the base or whatever before everybody just said, oh yeah, it's Harris. So in that sense, I do kind of get where you're coming from, but at the same time, to call that DEI is like, I mean, like that, like conservatives have poisoned that label so much for
Yeah, it's
regular
it's it's
people at
not
this point
it may
that
be
they
not
can't really use it.
factually true. It may not be factually true, but just in terms of what is this, call up in the popular mind, especially now since like corporations, they've been really like moving back the last few months with this DEI stuff. Now it's no longer popular. Now, like a lot of these consultants or whatever that sort of made it big in maybe 2020 off the back of George Floyd, like that's not really popular anymore or as popular as it used to be. The popular idea of what DI is, like especially among conservative types, like whether or not it's factual, like the point is you could easily now forcefully make that case against Harris because this is how the party treated her. And now I may be wrong about her lack of popularity, the reasons for it over the last 4 years, but I do think a big reason for that has to do with the fact that, rightly or wrongly, right, she's just associated with the border. No Democrat wants it. I think the very obvious reason why like Biden would put her there is because like, all right, how can I denigrate her as far as possible to make sure
Yeah.
that she's not actually a contender? I don't know when he decided to actually like, run again, but as soon as he made that decision, and maybe that was the decision all along, you can't have Kamala Harris, right, be seen as somebody that is competing with you. And that's true of all VPs, but to specifically like give her this like totally thankless like piece of shit task. Sorry, like this is
Mhm.
this is very, very, invisible man. let's watch her get the shit beat out of her publicly, right? That's probably a major reason why the numbers for her have been many times lower than they have been for Biden. And he's responsible for that. This is, Biden, the pro-black woman president, right? He did that, right? And I'm saying this in somebody, I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris, and I'm not enthusiastic
Yeah, I'm
about
not voting
it.
for that. I'm not
Yeah,
voting for her anyway.
but
We're
but
talking
but
so
but,
much, and neither of us is going to
yeah.
vote for any of these fucking
Yeah, but
people.
that's the thing. I think it's kind of fascinating. Like here, we're kind of like really getting to the nuances of all these discussions, and yet, like, we didn't even say at the beginning, like, sorry, we're not going to vote for any of these people. But I think we could have a very fair-minded discussion, and also just like have a discussion about what the optics are, what the strategy ought to be. In the patron show that we're going to go over into soon, I want to talk about the possible VP picks for Harris. So, like, I find this kind of stuff fun to discuss, but again, I don't consider it very serious in terms. To me, it's not serious politics anymore, in the sense that it's not actually going to do the things that you want it to do long term. If your goal is to avoid people like Trump from every 4 years being a threat, is this going to be now every 4 years a threat to democracy, a fascist? If that's the case, like, there's no way that the status quo is going to hold, right? Because eventually, right, if we have a 50-50 chance of being one or the other, eventually that so-called fascist, or whatever you want to call him, he's gonna take the presidency next time. So anyway, maybe we could move over to the patron show to continue this really in-depth discussion from two guys that are not going to vote for either of the two parties, and yet still treat them fairly, right? That's very rare. That's the thing. Like, as soon as you start saying, like, oh, these like cherry-picked statements from Harris, blah, 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 like, I feel like leftists, they would never, they would never give this kind of benefit of the doubt, this kind of fairness. But we do things a little differently here. We don't have to hide behind lies to make our case. So we're going to continue making the case on the patron show. Thank you guys for sticking around thus far. And for the patrons, we are transitioning to the show right now.
Like and subscribe.
Now you just said it to the patrons. All right, so I'm gonna move this back to the public show. Back to the public show. So you got a few more
I gotta
seconds.
do your job for you, Poppy. I gotta do your job for you sometimes.
I think at this
You're
point,
you're out of practice. You're rusty.
Honestly,
you've been deep in the editing mines. You haven't been doing as many shows lately.
I'm not gonna do any YouTube stuff until the movie's done. But the movie is almost done. Just like 3 weeks left. And then I could send it to the big boys for final comments, and it's going to be available. Not exactly sure when it's going to be available for the public, but it's going to be ready to go, and it's fucking fantastic. You have never seen some shit like this. I just re-recorded the narration. I'm doing so much, all these little things. That's the thing. It's only two guys doing this. We don't have an audio engineer. I'm the audio engineer. Me. I'm the audio engineer. I got a color engineer. We got, it's just us, right? And a couple people doing voicing and acting. So anyway, thank you for watching this far. And we are transitioning actually right now.